You know, they say your life can change in an instant. A phone call, a doctor's word, a single sentence spoken in a quiet room. But I've come to believe it's not the instant that changes you. It's the foundation that instant lands on. If your foundation is solid rock, you might stumble, but you'll stand. If it's sand, well, everything just washes away. My life with David was built on what I thought was granite. We met when I was 34, him 38. Quick pause. Before we continue, tell us where in the world are you watching from? If you're enjoying these stories, make sure to hit subscribe, because tomorrow's episode is absolutely mind-blowing. It wasn't a whirlwind. It was more like coming home after a long, confusing journey. I'd had my heart broken before, built up some sturdy walls around it. David didn't knock the walls down. He just patiently showed me where the door was and waited for me to be ready to open it. I remember the moment I knew. It was a Tuesday. Nothing special. We were in his apartment, and he was making spaghetti, and he'd gotten this absolutely ridiculous apron as a gift from his brother. It had a cartoon of a grilling lobster on it. And he was wearing it, completely unself-conscious, humming along to some old jazz record, and he turned to me and said, "You know, Ruth, I think I could get used to this view." And he wasn't looking at the city lights out the window. He was looking at me, and my walls. They just didn't seem to matter anymore. We built a good life. A quiet life. He was an architect, a man who believed in structures, in plans, in things that lasted. I was a freelance book editor, a woman who lived in the worlds of other people's stories. We fit. His solidity grounded my flights of fancy, and my love for narrative, I think, added a little color to his blueprints. We bought a small, sturdy house with a big oak tree in the backyard. We planted a garden. We talked about maybe traveling the coast in a camper van when he retired. We had plans. Oh God, we had so many plans. David's family was complicated. He had two younger brothers, Mark and Simon, where David was quiet and thoughtful. They were loud and all sharp edges. Mark, the middle brother, was a salesman. Everything was a transaction, a negotiation. He had a smile that never quite reached his eyes, a laugh that felt like it was calculating its own echo. Simon, the youngest, was a follower, his personality a faint carbon copy of whoever was loudest in the room, which was usually Mark. They were a closed unit, the two of them, and while David loved them, there was always a distance, a slight weariness in his voice after he got off the phone with them. I'll never forget the first family dinner I attended. Mark clapped David on the back a little too hard. "So, David finally roped someone in, huh? We were starting to think you were married to your T-squares." He turned his predatory smile on me. "You'll have to watch this one, Ruth. Holds a grudge like nobody's business. Still mad I borrowed his bike without asking in 1978. David had just smiled, a tight, thin line. "You didn't borrow it, Mark. You stole it, and you returned it with the frame bent." "Details, details." Mark laughed, and Simon chuckled along, a nervous, sycophantic sound. That was them. Everything was a joke, until it wasn't. The first crack in our foundation appeared on a perfectly ordinary Thursday. David came home from work early. I was in my office, up to my elbows in a manuscript about a doomed romance in Victorian England, and I heard the front door open and close with a soft, final click. Not his usual energetic entrance. I found him in the kitchen, standing by the sink, just staring out the window at the oak tree. His shoulders, usually so straight and sure, were slumped. "David, everything okay?" He turned, and his face was pale. "It's nothing, just a headache, a bad one." Behind my eyes. He tried to smile. Must be from squinting at too many site plans. We didn't know it then, but that was the first whisper of the storm. The headaches persisted. Then came the dizziness. The double vision. The world for my architect was becoming unstable, its lines blurring. The diagnosis, when it finally came after a battery of terrifying tests, was a brutal, swift blow, glioblastoma, an aggressive, malignant brain tumor. The world shrunk to the size of hospital rooms. The smell of antiseptic became our perfume. The gentle beeping of monitors was our soundtrack. I watched the man I loved, the man of plans and structures, have his own blueprint systematically erased. He fought. Oh, how he fought. Through the surgery, the radiation, the chemo that left him frail and hollowed out. There were good days, moments of lucidity where he'd hold my hand and talk about that camper van, about the redwood forests we'd visit. But they became fewer and farther between. It was during a relatively clear afternoon, about 6 months into the nightmare, that he brought up the will. We were sitting on the back porch, wrapped in blankets, watching the leaves on our oak tree turn to fire. "Ruth," he said, his voice a rough whisper now. We need to get things in order." My heart clenched. "Don't talk like that. You're going to beat this." He turned his head slowly, his eyes, once so sharp, now clouded with pain and medication, but burning with a fierce intensity. "Listen to me. The house, my life insurance, the investments, it's all for you. Everything. It's all in your name, or it goes to you. I've made sure of it. David, I don't care about any of that. I just care about you." "I know," he said, squeezing my hand with a strength that surprised me. "But I need to know you're safe. I need to know you're provided for. Promise me you'll be careful." "Careful of what?" He looked away, back towards the tree. "Just promise me." So I promised. And we went to the lawyer's office. It was a grim, formal affair. David, leaning heavily on me, dressed in a suit that now hung on his gaunt frame. The lawyer, a kind, older man named Mr. Yates, spoke in soft, measured tones. The will was simple, straightforward. I was the sole beneficiary, the executor. Everything was left to me, to do with as I saw fit. And the witnesses? David, in a moment of misguided familial loyalty, or perhaps just sheer exhaustion, had asked Mark and Simon to be there. He said he wanted them to see it, to understand his wishes, to be a part of it so there would be no confusion. I can still see them in that room. Mark, with that unreadable smile, clapping David on the shoulder. "Of course, brother. Anything for you." Simon, nodding earnestly. They signed the documents with a flourish. Mark even made a joke. "Don't spend it all in one place, Ruth." He'd winked, and the hair on my arm stood up. That night, after they'd left and I had put David to bed, I stood in that same kitchen where he'd first felt the headache. The house was silent, but it was a heavy, waiting silence. I replayed the scene in the lawyer's office. The way Mark's eyes had scanned every line of the document, not with brotherly concern, but with the assessing gaze of an appraiser. The way Simon had watched Mark for his cues. "He's just being Mark," I told myself. "You're just tired and scared, and you're looking for monsters in the shadows." But a small, cold voice, one that sounded a lot like my own intuition, whispered back, "Some foundations are built on sand, Ruth, and the tide is coming in." David died 3 weeks later. He slipped away in his sleep, his hand in mine. The silence in the room after his last breath was the loudest sound I have ever heard. It was a sound that swallowed the world. The following days were a blur of black clothes, casseroles that all tasted like ash, and a parade of sad faces. Mark and Simon were everywhere, suddenly. They handled the funeral arrangements, they spoke to the pastor, they stood beside me at the visitation, playing the part of the devoted, grieving brothers. They were so capable, so present. People kept telling me how lucky I was to have them. At the reception at our house after the burial, I was numb, a ghost moving through my own home. I found a moment of respite in the kitchen, leaning against the counter, just trying to remember how to breathe. Auntie Grace found me there. She wasn't my real aunt, but she might as well have been. She and my mother had been best friends since childhood, and when my mother passed, Grace had stepped in, a warm, soft presence in my life. She wrapped her arms around me, and I finally broke, sobbing into her lavender-scented cardigan. "Oh, my dear girl," she whispered, her voice thick with her own tears. "My dear, brave girl." When I could finally speak, the words tumbled out, raw and broken. "I don't know how to do this, Grace. I don't know how to be in this world without him." She held me at arm's length, her hands on my shoulders, her eyes, the color of warm tea, full of a deep, unwavering love. "You just put one foot in front of the other. You breathe in, and you breathe out. You don't have to know how to do it all today. You just have to get through this minute. Then the next." It was then that Mark walked into the kitchen. The mask of grief he'd been wearing all day seemed to have slipped slightly. His expression was businesslike. "Ruth," he said, his voice low, "I know this is a terrible time, but we need to talk. About the estate." Grace's hands tightened on my shoulders. "Mark, for heaven's sake, can't it wait?" The woman just buried her husband. He gave her a placating smile, the kind you'd give a fussy child. "It's just some practicalities, Grace. For Ruth's own good. We don't want things to get messy." He turned back to me. "Simon and we're here to help you through all of this. We can handle the probate, the paperwork. It's what David would have wanted, for us to look after you." The words were right, but the tone was all wrong. It was the tone he'd used when talking about a difficult client or a tricky business deal. My promise to David echoed in my mind. "Promise me you'll be careful." I looked at Mark, at that smile that didn't touch his eyes, and I felt the first grain of sand shift beneath my feet. "Thank you, Mark," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "But I think I can manage." His smile tightened. "Of course you can. You're a strong woman. But you don't have to. That's what family is for." He left the kitchen, and I looked at Grace. Her face was etched with worry. "Ruth," she said softly, "you be smart. You be very, very smart." I nodded, a cold dread beginning to pool in my stomach. The grief was still there, a vast, dark ocean inside me. But now, on its surface, a new, smaller, but much sharper fear had begun to sail. The funeral was over, the performance of family unity was coming to an end. And I was beginning to understand that the real battle for the life David and I had built was just beginning. Grief is a strange country. At first, you're just a tourist, lost and disoriented, surrounded by a language you don't understand. The customs are bizarre, waking up crying, forgetting to eat, talking to an empty room. But after a while, you're no longer a tourist. You become a permanent resident. You learn the landscape. You know where the sudden drops are, the hidden crevices that can swallow you whole. You learn to navigate the constant, low hum of absence. The first month after David's death, I was just a ghost in our house. I'd wander from room to room, touching his things, the wool sweater still draped over the back of his reading chair, the collection of pens on his desk, the faint, lingering scent of his sandalwood soap in the bathroom. The silence was a physical presence, heavy and suffocating. I'd play music, or leave the television on, just to drown it out, but it was no use. The silence was inside me. Mark and Simon called every few days. Their calls were always cloaked in concern. "Just checking in, Ruth. How are you holding up? Do you need anything?" At first, I was grateful. It was a tether to the world, a reminder that I wasn't completely alone. But the subtext, subtle at first, began to bleed through. "Have you heard from the life insurance company yet?" Mark asked one Tuesday morning. Not yet," I said, curled up on the sofa, still in my robe. "Mr. Yates is handling it." Good. You know, David had a significant policy. He was always so responsible. It's important that it's managed correctly. We wouldn't want you to be taken advantage of. The phrase hung in the air. Taken advantage of. By whom? The unspoken answer was, by me. Then Simon called a week later. Hey, Ruth. Listen, Mark and I were talking about the house. The roof is getting old. You should probably get it inspected. It's a big responsibility for one person. Maybe we should come over this weekend, take a look, see what kind of shape it's really in. A cold knot tightened in my stomach. That's not necessary, Simon. I'm perfectly capable of calling a roofer. Of course you are, he said, his voice patronizing. We're just trying to help. It's what family does. Family. The word was starting to sound like a threat. The true unraveling began 6 weeks after the funeral. The official, legal unraveling. I was in Mr. Yates's office, sitting in the same leather chair I'd occupied with David. The room felt colder now, emptier. Mr. Yates, a man with a kind face etched with the lines of 1,000 difficult conversations, steepled his fingers. Ruth, I've received a letter from a law firm. Bernstein and Crow. I'd never heard of them. Regarding? They are representing your brothers-in-law, Mark and Simon. The world tilted slightly. Representing them for what? He took a deep breath. They are formally contesting the will. The words didn't make sense at first. They were just sounds. Contesting. The will. I replayed them in my head, slowly, and felt the floor drop out from under me. What? On what grounds? They are alleging undue influence. He said the words gently, as if they were made of glass. Undue influence, I echoed, a hollow laugh escaping my lips. I influenced a dying man to leave everything to his wife, the woman he'd been married to for nearly 20 years? The claim is that you isolated him from his brothers in his final months, Mr. Yates explained, his voice neutral and professional. That you manipulated his medication and his state of mind. That you pressured him into creating a will that disinherited his blood relatives in favor of yourself. The sheer breathtaking audacity of it left me speechless. I saw David, pale and weak, insisting on having his brothers there as witnesses. I remembered his warning. Promise me you'll be careful. He hadn't been talking about strangers. He'd been talking about them. This is insane, I finally whispered, my voice trembling. They were there. They signed the document. They saw him. They spoke to him. I know, Mr. Yates said. But contesting a will is not about truth, Ruth. Not always. It's about creating a narrative, a compelling alternative story that introduces enough doubt to challenge the document's validity. They are claiming that David was not of sound mind when he signed, and that you were the orchestrating force. He slid a copy of the letter across the desk. The legal language was dense, cold, and accusatory. Phrases jumped out at me. Vulnerable testator, suspicious timing, unnatural disposition of assets. It was like reading a libelous obituary of my own character. I left Mr. Yates's office in a daze. The sunny afternoon felt obscene. People were walking down the street, laughing, carrying shopping bags, living their normal, uninterrupted lives. My world had just been declared a war zone, and nobody else could see the bombs falling. I drove home on autopilot. As I turned onto my street, I saw a car parked in my driveway, Mark's car. My heart began to hammer against my ribs. He was standing on the porch, waiting. I got out of the car, my legs unsteady. Mark, what are you doing here? He gave me that same, empty smile. We need to talk, Ruth. I assume you've heard from your lawyer. I have. I didn't invite him in. I stood my ground at the bottom of the porch steps. Undue influence? How could you? How could you dishonor David's memory like this? His smile vanished, replaced by a mask of wounded righteousness. Dishonor him? We're dishonoring him? Ruth, we are protecting our brother's legacy. That money, those investments, the business he started, that's family money. It's the fruit of our parents' hard work, of our shared history. It doesn't just belong to you. He wanted it to belong to me, I said, my voice shaking with a mixture of grief and rage. He wrote it down. He signed it. You witnessed it. He wasn't himself. Mark's voice rose, sharp and cutting. He was sick. He was confused. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So, if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. And you were in his ear every day, filling his head with nonsense, turning him against us. You swooped in at the end, and you took advantage of a dying man. The cruelty of the accusation stole my breath. I felt tears of pure, hot anger spring to my eyes. Get off my porch, Mark. This doesn't have to be ugly, Ruth, he said, his tone shifting back to a deceptive, reasonable calm. We can settle this. Out of court. We're prepared to be generous. You can keep the house, though God knows how you'll afford the taxes on it. But the life insurance, the investment portfolios, the business assets, those rightfully belong to the family. Sign them over, and we'll drop the contest. You can walk away with your dignity intact. There it was. The offer. The compromise. It was a velvet-gloved fist. He was offering me the gilded cage, the shell of my life, but none of the means to sustain it. He was offering me a future of financial struggle and dependence, probably on them. It was the first overt act of financial abuse, dressed up as a benevolent settlement. I looked at him, at this man who had shared childhood with my husband, and I saw a stranger. A greedy, calculating stranger. No, I said, the word quiet but absolute. His face hardened. No, I will not sign over a single thing that David wanted me to have. If you want to fight me, then fight me. But I warn you, Mark, you have no idea what you're starting. A cold, nasty smirk twisted his lips. It was the real Mark, finally unveiled. Oh, I think I do, Ruth, I think I do. You're a book editor. You live in a world of stories. We live in the real world. And in the real world, this is a fight you cannot win. You'll be buried in legal fees. You'll be alone. Everyone will see you for what you are. We'll make sure of it. He walked down the steps, brushing past me, and got into his car. He didn't look back as he drove away. I stood there, rooted to the spot, trembling from head to toe. The silence of the house behind me, once a presence of grief, now felt like a void. An abyss. He was right about one thing. I was alone. Profoundly, terrifyingly alone. I don't know how long I stood there, but eventually, I fumbled for my phone. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely dial. I didn't call Mr. Yates. I needed something else. I needed a voice that wasn't coded in legalese or venom. I called Auntie Grace. She answered on the second ring. Ruth, honey? Is everything all right? And I broke. The whole story tumbled out, the letter, the allegations, Mark's visit, his threats. I sobbed into the phone, the fear, and the anger, and the devastating sense of betrayal, all pouring out in a torrent of incoherent pain. She listened. She didn't interrupt. She just let me fall apart. When I was finally spent, my breathing ragged hiccups, she spoke, her voice calm and steady, an anchor in my hurricane. Oh, my dear girl, listen to me. You listen to me right now. You are not alone. Do you hear me? You are not. You have me. And you have Clara. And we are your family. Those vultures do not get to define you. They do not get to rewrite your story with David. But he said, I can't win. He said they'll bury me in legal fees, that everyone will believe them. Let them try. Grace said, and I could hear the iron in her gentle voice. You are Ruth. You are David's wife. He chose you. He trusted you. And he knew exactly what his brothers were. That's why he made you promise to be careful. He was giving you your marching orders, my love. Now, you are going to go inside your house, and you are going to make yourself a cup of tea. And tomorrow, you and I are going to go see Clara. Do you understand? We are going to war. And you do not go to war without your generals. I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. The tears were still flowing, but they were different now. They were no longer tears of helplessness. They were tears of release, of letting go of the shock, and making room for something else. Something harder, something fiercer. "Okay, Grace," I whispered. "Okay." I hung up the phone and looked at my house. Our house, David's and mine. It wasn't just a structure of wood and brick anymore, it was a symbol. It was the hill I was going to die on, if I had to. Mark was right about one thing: this was the real world. And in the real world, even the quietest, most broken of residents can learn to fight for their home. The unraveling was complete. The threads of my old life, of the woman who was just a grieving widow, had been pulled apart. Now, I had to start weaving something new, something stronger, something with threads of steel. The tourist in the country of grief was gone. I was a resident now. And I was preparing for a war I never asked for, on a land I never wanted to defend. The tea Auntie Grace had prescribed sat untouched on my coffee table, a dark, cold puddle in the bottom of the cup. I couldn't stomach it. The conversation with Mark had left a toxic residue in my mouth, a taste like copper and lies. His words echoed in the silent house, twisting the familiar spaces into something hostile. That bookshelf wasn't just a bookshelf anymore, it was an asset. The oak tree outside the window wasn't just a tree, it was part of the property value his brothers were trying to claw away from me. Sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Mark's smirk, heard the cold legal language of the Bernstein and Crow letter, undue influence. The phrase was a stain, and it was spreading. What would our friends think? Our neighbors? The people at the grocery store who would ask, with pitying eyes, how I was holding up. Would they look at me now and see a grieving widow or a cunning manipulator? The next morning, I moved through the house like a ghost, but a ghost filled with a new, jittery energy. It was a kind of furious grief. I was no longer just mourning David. I was mourning the simple, straightforward truth of our life together, which was now being publicly called into question. At 10 o'clock sharp, Grace's car pulled into the driveway. Seeing her get out, a sturdy, reliable figure in a simple blue dress, felt like my first full breath in hours. She carried a wicker basket, and the scent of warm banana bread wafted into the house as I opened the door. She didn't say a word about my puffy eyes or the robe I was still wearing. She just walked in, set the basket on the kitchen counter, and pulled me into a fierce, lavender-scented hug. "Right," she said, finally releasing me and patting my back. "First we eat, then we strategize. You can't fight dragons on an empty stomach." She cut thick slices of the banana bread, slathered them with butter, and pushed a plate toward me. I took a bite to please her, and the simple, comforting flavor was a small anchor in the raging sea of my anxiety. "Now," she said, stirring honey into her tea. "Tell me everything again. From the beginning. Leave nothing out." So I did. I repeated the lawyer's words, Mark's threats, the specific phrasing of the generous settlement offer. As I spoke, Grace's face, usually so soft, grew still and focused. "The house, but not the means to keep it," she murmured when I finished. "It's a gilded cage, Ruth. They want to make you a prisoner in a beautiful, empty shell. You'd be utterly dependent on their goodwill, which we now know doesn't exist. The moment you needed a new roof, a new furnace, you'd have to go to them, cap in hand. They'd own you without ever having to put your name on a deed." Hearing her articulate it so clearly made the horror of it even more vivid. "What do I do, Grace, Mr. Yates says we have to respond, that we can't ignore it. But the cost, Mark said they'd bury me in legal fees." "Then we won't let them," a new voice said from the doorway. We both turned. Auntie Clara stood there, a silhouette against the morning light. I hadn't even heard her come in. She must have used the spare key David had insisted we give her for emergencies. He'd always had a soft spot for Clara's no-nonsense practicality. Where Grace was soft curves and gentle colors, Clara was all sharp angles and uncompromising lines. At 75, she stood straight as a ruler, her silver hair cut in a severe bob that framed a face with eyes that missed nothing. She was my father's sister, and she had never suffered fools gladly. "Clara," I said, my voice catching with a mixture of relief and apprehension. Thank you for coming." She marched into the kitchen, her sensible shoes making firm clicks on the tile floor. She placed her large utilitarian handbag on the table with a definitive thud. "Where else would I be?" I heard. She looked from me to Grace. "So, the jackals are at the door, and you're sitting here eating banana bread." "We were fortifying ourselves, Clara," Grace said gently. "Fortify later," Clara said, her gaze landing on me. "First, you need to understand what this is. This is not a family disagreement. This is a hostile takeover. They see you as a weak link, an obstacle to what they believe is theirs. They are not trying to reason with you. They are trying to break you. This offer," she gestured dismissively, as if swatting a fly, "this keep the house nonsense, is their opening gambit. They expect you to be emotional, frightened, and alone. They expect you to fold." I straightened my spine under her scrutinizing gaze. "I'm not going to fold." "Good," she said, a flicker of approval in her steely eyes. "Then stop crying and start thinking. You were married to an architect, a businessman. Did he keep records, files, a home office?" "Yes, of course." "In the study. Then that is your first battlefield. We are not going to wait for them to come at us with more legal papers. We are going to go on the offensive. We are going to find every single document, every receipt, every scrap of paper that proves this was your life, built with your husband. We will find the evidence that shows you were a partner, not a predator." Her words were a spark in the kindling of my despair. Action, purpose. It was the antidote to the paralyzing fear. "She's right, Ruth," Grace said, reaching over and squeezing my hand. "We need to know what we're dealing with. All of it." And so, we moved into David's study. It was a room I had largely avoided since his death. It was to him, his large oak desk, the blueprint tube stacked in a corner, the framed photographs on the wall of buildings he had designed. It smelled of old paper, wood polish, and him. For a moment, I hesitated at the threshold, overwhelmed by a fresh wave of grief. Clara put a firm hand on my back. "He is not in this room, Ruth. He is in your heart. What is in this room are the tools you need to defend what he left you. Now, come on." We started with the filing cabinets. It was a mammoth task. David was meticulous. There were files for mortgage payments, property taxes, utility bills, going back decades. There were folders for every home improvement project, every insurance policy. Grace took on the task of organizing the household files, creating a clear, chronological paper trail of our shared life. Clara, with her sharp, analytical mind, zeroed in on the financial files. Investment statements, retirement account summaries, records from the small architecture firm David had run. It was Clara who found the first discrepancy. "Ruth," she said, her voice tight. "These quarterly statements from his investment portfolio. The ones from the last year." I walked over to her. She had spread out the statements on the desk. "What about them?" "Look at the transaction history." She pointed a bony finger at a line item from about 9 months before David died. "See this? A transfer out. $50,000 to an account numbered 4881XB. I stared at it. A transfer? To where? He never mentioned that. Exactly. Clara's lips were a thin line. And look here, 3 months later. Another transfer. 30,000, same destination account. My heart began to beat a frantic rhythm. That doesn't make any sense. We were saving that money. It was for our retirement. For the camper van. The dream felt like a cruel joke now. Do you have online access to these accounts? Clara asked. I think so. David set up all the passwords. They're in his password book. I found the small, black leather book in his top desk drawer. My hands were shaking as I flipped through it. I found the entry for the investment firm, logged onto his laptop, and entered the credentials. The portfolio summary loaded. The total value was significantly lower than I had expected. I navigated to the transaction history and saw the same transfers Clara had found on the paper statements. But on the screen, the destination was listed not just as an account number but with a faint, almost hidden tag, BUS. Op Act, Business Operating Account, I whispered. But his business account is with First National. I have the checkbook for it right here. I pulled open the desk drawer and showed her the checkbook for David Wright Architecture, LLC. This, Clara said, tapping the screen, is a different account. Do you have any records for it? Any statements? We scoured the filing cabinet. We pulled out every folder. There was nothing for an account numbered 4881XB. A cold dread was solidifying in my gut. What is this, Clara? I don't know, she said, her voice grim. But it's money. A lot of money. And it's gone somewhere you don't know about. This is what Mark meant when he said business assets. He knows about this account. The gilded cage suddenly had a hidden, locked door. They weren't just trying to take my future. They were trying to take pieces of my past, of the life David and I had already lived. They were claiming I had manipulated him, while they had possibly been siphoning money from him while he was sick and vulnerable. Just then, my phone rang. It was an unknown number. I showed it to Clara. Answer it, she commanded. Put it on speaker, and say nothing until you know who it is. I took a deep breath and answered. Hello? Ruth? It's Simon. Grace and Clara exchanged a look. Grace's face was worried. Clara's was like granite. Simon, I said, my voice flat. Listen, Ruth, he said, his tone artificially cheerful. I know things got a little heated with Mark yesterday. He's under a lot of pressure. We all are. But we're family. We don't want to see you get hurt in all this. I remained silent, as instructed. Clara nodded at me, encouraging me to wait. So, he continued, filling the silence, we've talked it over. We've come up with a new offer, a better one. We'll drop the contest of the will, right now. Today, you keep the house, free and clear. And we'll even let you keep, let's say, 25% of the life insurance payout. That's more than enough for you to live on comfortably. You can put this whole ugly business behind you. No lawyers, no court, no nasty gossip. What do you say? The gilded cage was being offered again, this time with a slightly larger food dish. Let you keep. The phrasing was a masterpiece of manipulation, implying it was theirs to give. And the amount 25% was so specific, so calculated. It was just enough to seem generous, but not enough for me to ever truly feel secure. It was designed to keep me quiet and compliant. I looked at Clara. Her eyes were blazing with cold fire. She shook her head once, a sharp, definitive motion. I found my voice, and it was steadier than I expected. Simon, I said. I know about account 4881XB. The silence on the other end of the line was absolute. It was so profound I could hear the blood pounding in my own ears. It lasted for a full 10 seconds. I don't know what you're talking about, he finally stammered. But the artificial cheer was gone, replaced by a flustered panic. I think you do, I said, the pieces clicking into place. You and Mark, you were moving money out of David's portfolio while he was sick. You were stealing from your own brother, and now you have the gall to try and steal the rest from me. That's a lie, he shouted, his voice cracking. He authorized those transfers. It was for the business. You don't understand anything about business. Then produce the records, Simon, I said, a strange calm settling over me. Show me the statements for that account. Show me where David authorized it. He was sputtering now, a mess of incoherent denials and threats. "You're making a huge mistake, Ruth. You're going to regret this. We'll see you in court. You'll end up with nothing, nothing." He hung up. The dial tone buzzed in the quiet study. I set the phone down slowly. My hands were no longer shaking. The fear had been burned away, replaced by a clean, cold rage. Grace let out a long, slow breath. "Oh, my Lord." Clara looked at me, and for the first time that day, a real, small smile touched her lips. It wasn't a warm smile. It was the smile of a seasoned general who has just seen her rookie soldier win their first skirmish. "There," she said softly. "Now you have your first weapon. They weren't expecting that. They thought you were a mouse. You just showed them your teeth." I looked around the study, at the ghosts of my old life. The grief was still there, a permanent part of my landscape. But it was no longer the only thing defining me. I was also a woman who had been betrayed, who was being hunted, and who had just learned how to hunt back. The gilded cage was still there, its door held open by my brothers-in-law, but I was no longer considering stepping inside. I was going to tear the damn thing down, piece by gilded piece. The discovery of the hidden account changed everything. It was no longer just about defending David's will, it was about uncovering his truth. The quiet, methodical task of going through his study was no longer an act of grief-stricken nostalgia. It was a forensic investigation. We were archaeologists of a life that had been tampered with, digging for the real story buried under layers of deceit. The phone call with Simon had left a charged silence in its wake. Grace was the first to break it, her voice full of a kind of reverent horror. They were stealing from him, while he was dying. She shook her head, as if trying to dislodge a thought too ugly to hold. What kind of people do that? The kind who see a dying man not as a brother, but as a failing business, Clara said, her voice dripping with contempt. She was already back at the desk, her fingers flying across the keyboard of David's laptop, searching for more digital footprints. "This business operating account, it's the key. We need to find out where it leads. Ruth, did David have a lawyer for his business? Separate from Mr. Yates?" I thought hard, sifting through memories that felt hazy, obscured by the fog of the last terrible year. I'm not sure. He handled most of his business himself. He had an accountant, a man named Phil Denton, for taxes, but a lawyer, he never mentioned one. "Find Phil Denton's number," Clara commanded. "We need to talk to him." I found the contact in David's address book. My finger hovered over the dial button on my phone. A new anxiety was taking root. What if Phil was in on it? What if he was part of their scheme? The world was suddenly full of potential enemies. "What do I say to him?" I asked, my voice small. "You say you are the executor of your husband's estate, and you are reconciling his financial records," Clara said without looking up from the screen. "You ask him, as a matter of routine, if he has any records pertaining to a business account numbered 4881XB. You are calm, you are professional. You give nothing away." I took a deep breath, channeling Clara's steeliness, and made the call. It went to voicemail. I left a carefully worded message, my heart hammering against my ribs. I hung up, feeling both relieved and frustrated. "Now what?" I asked. "Now," Clara said, closing the laptop. "With a definitive snap, we look for something else. Something they wouldn't think to look for. Did David have a safe? A lockbox? Somewhere he kept things that were truly important, truly private?" The question triggered a memory, so faint and distant it was like a whisper from another lifetime. It was from before he got sick, maybe a year or two before. We'd been cleaning out the garage, and he'd been up in the rafters, handing down boxes. I'd reached for a small, metal box tucked behind a beam, and he'd said, quickly, almost sharply, "Leave that one, Ruth. That's just old junk. Tax stuff from years ago. I'll deal with it later." At the time, I hadn't thought twice about it. David was the organized one, I trusted his systems implicitly. but now the memory surfaced with new, startling clarity. The quickness of his response, the slight edge in his voice. He hadn't wanted me to see what was in that box. "The garage," I said, standing up so suddenly my chair rolled back and hit the bookshelf. "There's a metal box in the rafters." We marched into the garage, a determined procession of three. The space was cool and smelled of gasoline and damp concrete. I pointed to the beam where I remembered seeing it. Clara, despite her age, was the most practical. She found the stepladder, climbed up, and after a moment of searching, handed down a dusty, gunmetal gray box, about the size of a large shoebox. It was a sentry safe. We carried it back into the kitchen and set it on the table. There was a combination lock. "Do you know the code?" Grace asked, her voice hushed. I shook my head. "He never told me. I never even knew what was in it." We stared at it. This simple, locked box felt more significant than any legal document. It was a secret David had kept. A secret from me? Or a secret for me? "Think, Ruth," Clara urged. "Birthdays? Anniversaries? The house number?" I tried them all. Our wedding date, the day we met, the number of our first apartment, nothing. The lock remained stubbornly shut. I sat back, defeated. "It's no use." "He was an architect," Clara mused, not giving up. "He loved numbers, patterns. What was his favorite number? A number that meant something to him, professionally, maybe?" I closed my eyes, trying to think like David. "He loved the Fibonacci sequence, the golden ratio. He'd point it out in seashells, in flower petals. But that wasn't a single number." Then I remembered something else. He had a thing for the number 17. He said it was a prime number, indivisible, strong. He joked that he'd designed his first successful project when he was 17, and it had become his lucky number. He'd even wanted to get married on the 17th, but the venue wasn't available. With a trembling hand, I reached out and spun the dial. I tried 1700. Our wedding year? No. I tried 1717. Nothing. In desperation, I tried just 1 to 7. The lock didn't open. "Maybe it needs more digits," Grace suggested softly. I thought about the hidden account. 4,881. Was it a date? The 8th of April 1981? That was before I knew him. I tried 040881. Nothing. Frustration boiled over. I put my head in my hands. I can't do it. I can't think like him anymore. They're stealing his memory, and I can't even open his damn box. "Stop," Clara said, her voice not unkind but firm. "Pity is a luxury you cannot afford. He was a meticulous man. He would not have left this to chance. The answer is something you would know, something that connects to you, something that connects to me." And then, it came to me. A silly, private joke. Early in our relationship, we'd gone to a county fair. We'd gone on a Ferris wheel, and I'd been terrified, gripping his arm so tightly I left bruises. To calm me down, he'd started pointing out the patterns in the fairground lights below. "Look," he'd said. "It's like a circuit board, a city of joy." He'd kissed my forehead. Our city. And from then on, whenever we were in a high place, he'd squeeze my hand and say, "Don't worry, Ruth, we're just checking the circuits of our city." Our city. The number. What was the number? I looked up, my eyes meeting Clara's. "The number of this house," I whispered. 2147. He always said it was the coordinates of our city. I reached for the lock. I spun the dial. 2147. There was a soft, satisfying click. The sound was so final, so significant, that for a moment, none of us moved. Then, slowly, I lifted the lid. There were no stacks of cash, no glittering jewels. The contents were mundane, and yet, they took my breath away. On top lay a bundle of letters, tied with a faded ribbon. My own letters, from when we were dating and I'd gone to visit my sister for a month. He'd kept them. Beneath that was the grilling lobster apron, neatly folded. He'd kept that, too. But underneath these sentimental treasures were documents. A thick envelope from a law firm I didn't recognize. Henderson and Gray. And beneath that, a small, blue, fabric-covered book. A diary. My hands were shaking as I picked up the legal envelope. I slid out the contents. It was a will, dated just 3 months before his diagnosis. The date hit me like a physical blow. This was created when he was perfectly healthy, in his prime. I skimmed the first page. It was similar to the one Mr. Yates had drawn up everything to me. But then I turned the page. There was a new section, a clause I had never seen before. Article 4, Section B, Disinheritance of Mark and Simon Wright. I specifically disinherit my brothers, Mark Wright and Simon Wright, and direct that they shall receive no share, portion, or distribution from my estate, of any kind, whether under this will or any laws of intestate succession. This disinheritance is intentional and is made due to a fundamental breakdown of our relationship, rooted in their long-standing pattern of financial exploitation and personal manipulation, which I no longer wish to enable. I read the words aloud, my voice a choked whisper. The room was utterly silent. Grace had her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide. Clara stood perfectly still, her arms crossed, taking it in. He knew. Long before he was sick, he knew what they were. He had seen their true nature and had taken steps to protect me, to protect us. He had hidden this will because he was afraid, not of me, of them. There's more, I said, my vision blurring with tears, not of sadness, but of a profound vindicating relief. I flipped to the last page. It was signed, witnessed by 2 people whose names I didn't recognize. It was legal. It was binding. It was David's true voice, loud and clear, cutting through their lies from beyond the grave. Then I picked up the small, blue diary. I opened it. The entries were sporadic, in David's neat, architectural script. They weren't about feelings or daily life. They were notes, records. I flipped to an entry dated about a year before his diagnosis. March 14th, met with M and S, they're at it again. Leveraging the family name. A consolidated family investment strategy. Translation: they want access to my capital. They presented a proposal for a real estate venture. The numbers don't add up. Told them no. M was furious, said I was hoarding my success. S just sat there, looking pathetic. The pressure is relentless. I've told Ruth they're just ambitious, but it's more than that. It's a hunger, and I'm afraid it's a hunger that can never be satisfied. Another entry, a few months later, June 2nd. Discovered a $10K withdrawal from the business account I share with M for project expenses. No invoice, no explanation. Confronted him. He said it was for client development, too sensitive to document. He lied to my face. I know it. I've opened a new private operating account, 4,881 XB, to shield our core assets. I can't believe it's come to this. Spying on my own brother. But I have to protect us. I have to protect Ruth. The final entry was just a few lines, dated the week before he told me about the headaches. September 8th. They found out about the new account. S let it slip. M is ice cold. Says I've broken trust. The irony is staggering. I've placed the new will and this journal in the safe. Ruth doesn't need this ugliness. But if anything ever happens to me, she needs to know the truth. She needs to know I saw them for what they were, and that I chose her. I always chose her. I closed the book, holding it to my chest as if it were his own heart. The weight of his secret, the burden he had carried to shield me, was almost too much to bear. He had lived with this knowledge, this disappointment, and fear, and he had faced his own mortality bearing this extra, hidden load. Grace was crying softly, dabbing her eyes with a tissue. Oh, that poor dear man. Clara walked over and put a hand on my shoulder. Her touch was surprisingly gentle. He loved you very much, Ruth. This is the proof. Not the house, not the money. This. He went to war for you before the war even started. I looked from the will to the diary, lying on my kitchen table. The whispered memory had led to a shout. David's true voice was in this room. It was no longer my word against Mark and Simon's. It was David's word against theirs. The game had changed. Again. I wasn't just a widow fighting for her inheritance. I was my husband's designated warrior, finally handed the battle plans he had drawn up in secret. The fear was gone, completely. In its place was a purpose so clear, so bright, it was like a beacon. They laughed when I went to court, I said, my voice quiet but ringing with certainty. But they haven't read this. They have no idea what's coming for them. I picked up the phone. This time, my hand was perfectly steady. I didn't call Mr. Yates. I called the number on the envelope for Henderson and Gray. It was time to bring in David's real army. The voice that answered the phone at Henderson and Gray was crisp, efficient, and utterly devoid of the comforting warmth I'd always associated with Mr. Yates. Henderson and Gray, attorneys at law. How may I direct your call? For a moment, I was tongue-tied. How did one explain this? Hello, my dead husband left a secret will with you, and I just found it in a lockbox he hid from me. I took a steadying breath, channeling the authority I'd found just moments before. My name is Ruth Wright. I'm the widow of David Wright. I believe your firm prepared a will for him. I have it here in front of me, and I need to speak with someone immediately. It's a matter of some urgency. There was a brief pause, the click of a keyboard. One moment, Mrs. Wright. I'll connect you with Mr. Henderson's office. The hold music was a bland, classical piece. Grace and Clara were watching me, their faces a mirror of my own tense anticipation. Grace had her hands clasped under her chin as if in prayer. Clara stood with her arms crossed, a sentinel of resolve. A new voice came on the line, older, with a gravelly depth that commanded attention. Mrs. Wright, Charles Henderson. I was very sorry to hear about David. He was a good man. You knew him? The question slipped out, laced with surprise. I did, not socially. Professionally. He was very precise, very clear about his intentions. I assume you're calling about the testamentary documents he executed with us. I am. I found them. About 20 minutes ago, I see. Another pause, this one more weighted. David was quite insistent on confidentiality. He gave me strict instructions that the documents were only to be released upon his death, and only to you, directly. I was planning to reach out to you this week, once the initial turmoil had passed. I take it, circumstances have forced your hand? You could say that, I replied, a dry, humorless laugh escaping me. His brothers are contesting the later will, the one they witnessed. They're alleging I unduly influenced a dying man. On the other end of the line, I heard a low, understanding hum. Ah, that does track with David's concerns. He was quite specific about their proclivities. Mrs. Wright, you need to bring these documents to my office. Today, if possible. We need to file the earlier will with the probate court immediately. It revokes and replaces all prior wills, including the one your brothers-in-law are attempting to leverage. A wave of relief so powerful it felt like a physical force washed over me. We can be there in an hour. Excellent. I'll have my assistant clear my schedule. I hung up and looked at my aunties. We have to go. Now. To his office in the city. Grace immediately began gathering her things. I'll drive. You're in no state. Clara was already carefully placing the will and the diary back into the metal box. She handled them as if they were holy relics. This, she said, closing the lid with a soft click, is the truth. And the truth, properly presented, is the most powerful weapon in the world. The drive into the city was a blur. I sat in the passenger seat, the metal box on my lap, my hands resting protectively on its cool surface. I stared out the window but saw nothing of the passing suburbs, the converging highways, the growing skyline. My mind was replaying the entries from David's diary. I've told Ruth they're just ambitious, but it's more than that. It's a hunger. He had lived with that knowledge. He had carried the weight of their greed so I wouldn't have to. The love in that act was so vast it was almost terrifying. Henderson and Gray was located in a sleek, modern high-rise, a world away from Mr. Yates's cozy wood-paneled office. The reception area was all cool marble, minimalist, art, and hushed tones. We were shown immediately into a conference room with a breathtaking view of the city, the very circuits David and I had looked down upon from that Ferris wheel a lifetime ago. Charles Henderson was a man in his late 60s, with a full head of white hair and eyes that held a weary, penetrating intelligence. He stood as we entered, shaking my hand with a firm, dry grip. "Mrs. Wright, a pleasure, albeit under difficult circumstances." He nodded to Grace and Clara. "Ladies, Saturday I placed the metal box on the polished conference table and opened it." I handed him the will first. He put on a pair of reading glasses and scanned the document, his expression neutral. He nodded slowly. "Yes. This is the executed original, duly witnessed and notarized. It is, without question, his last true will and testament." He set it down and looked at me. "The will they are contesting is legally void. It was superseded by this one the moment David signed it." "But they witnessed the later one," I said, confusion knitting my brow. "Wouldn't that make it valid?" "No," Henderson said, shaking his head. "A later will always revokes an earlier one, regardless of who witnesses it. The fact that they witnessed a document that was already legally invalid is ironic, to say the least. It demonstrates they were present for a performance, not a legitimate legal act. It strengthens our position considerably." Then I handed him the blue diary. "And there's this." He kept a journal. "It explains everything." Henderson took it. He didn't read it through, but he flipped to a few of the entries I had marked with slips of paper. His face remained an impassive mask, but I saw a muscle in his jaw tighten as he read David's words about the withdrawn money, the hunger, the need to protect me. He closed the book gently. "This is compelling," he said, his voice low and serious. "It provides the why. The court needs to understand the testator's state of mind, his intentions. This journal leaves no doubt. David Wright was of sound and discerning mind when he disinherited his brothers. He did so with clear-eyed understanding of their character. This journal is the foundation upon which we will build our entire defense, no, our offense." He leaned forward, steepling his fingers. "Our strategy is now simple. We will immediately file this will with the probate court. We will then file a motion for summary judgment, asking the judge to throw out their contest based on the incontrovertible validity of this earlier will. We will attach relevant excerpts from this journal as exhibits. We will argue that their lawsuit is not only without merit, but is a continuation of the very financial and emotional exploitation that led David to disinherit them in the first place. Will it work?" Grace asked, her voice full of hope. "It's the strongest position we could possibly be in," Henderson said. "They have based their entire case on a lie. We have the truth in David's own hand. Judges do not look kindly on those who abuse the judicial process to pursue frivolous, predatory claims. This," he tapped the diary, "is their death knell." He gathered the documents. "I will have my team begin drafting the filings immediately. We will serve Mark and Simon before the day is out." He looked at me. "Ruth, you need to prepare yourself. Their reaction to this will not be pleasant. They are cornered animals now. They will likely lash out." I met his gaze. The fear that had once coiled in my stomach was gone. "Let them." A small, approving smile touched his lips. "David said you were strong. He said you just didn't know it yet." He stood, signaling the meeting was over. "I'll be in touch the moment we have news." We drove home in a different kind of silence. It wasn't the heavy, grieving silence of before, or the tense, anxious silence of the morning. It was the quiet of a battlefield after the tide has turned, the dust still settling, but the outcome no longer in doubt. When we got back to the house, the light on my answering machine was blinking. I pressed play. It was Mr. Yates, his voice sounding tired and concerned. "Ruth, it's Alan Yates. I've just received a very aggressively worded motion from Bernstein and Crow. They're seeking an emergency hearing to freeze all estate assets, including the house, pending the outcome of their suit. They're claiming you're a flight risk. It's a scare tactic, a bad one, but we need to respond quickly. Please call me." I looked at Grace and Clara. For the first time, I smiled. A real, genuine smile. It felt strange on my face, like a muscle long unused. "Too late," I said softly to the machine. I picked up the phone and called Mr. Yates back. When he answered, I didn't let him launch into his concerns. "Alan," I said, my voice calm and clear. "Thank you for your call. There's been a development. I've retained new counsel. Charles Henderson of Henderson and Gray. He's handling everything from here on out." There was a stunned silence on the other end. "Henderson? But how? Why?" "David had a second will, Alan. An earlier one. He hid it from me. It disinherits Mark and Simon explicitly. I found it today. Henderson drafted it. He's filing it with the court as we speak, along with a motion for summary judgment." The silence this time was profound. I could almost hear the gears turning in his mind, the entire case flipping on its head. "My God," he finally breathed. "The implications. Ruth, this is extraordinary." "It is," I agreed. "I'll have Henderson forward you all the documentation. I appreciate all your help, Alan, but we won't be needing to respond to their scare tactics." "No," he said, a new note of respect in his voice. "No, I suppose you won't. Congratulations, Ruth." David was always smarter than everyone else in the room. "Yes," I said, my eyes drifting to the oak tree in the backyard, its branches strong and enduring against the sky. "Yes, he was." I hung up. The three of us stood in the kitchen, the late afternoon sun streaming in, painting the room in gold. "So," Clara said, breaking the silence. "We wait." "We wait," I echoed, but waiting no longer felt like a passive, fearful state. It felt like the calm, coiled tension before a predator strikes. We had laid the trap. We had the evidence. Now, we just had to wait for Mark and Simon to take the final, fatal step into it. The secret was out of the box, and it was about to explode in their faces. The wait was a strange, suspended animation. The high of discovering the will and diary, the decisive meeting with Henderson, had created a peak of defiant energy. But as the hours ticked by with no word, the adrenaline began to fade, leaving behind a hollow, echoing quiet in the house. The reality of the situation started to seep back in, colder and darker than before. This wasn't just a legal puzzle to be solved. It was a war against people I had once broken bread with, people who had held my husband as a baby. The phone rang again around 7 that evening. The caller ID showed Mark's number. My heart gave a single, hard thud against my ribs. This was it, the lashing out Henderson had predicted. I took a deep breath, nodded to Clara and Grace, who were watching me intently from the living room, and answered. "Hello, Mark." His voice was a low, venomous snarl, stripped of all pretense. "You conniving bitch." The ugliness of the words, the sheer hatred in his tone, was a physical blow. I gripped the countertop to steady myself. "I assume you've been served. A secret will. A diary?" He spat. "You think you're so clever, don't you? Forging documents, planting evidence. Do you really think anyone is going to believe that garbage, that David would ever write those things?" "He did write them," I said, my voice remarkably level, "and the forensics will prove it. It's his handwriting, his words." His truth. His truth? Mark let out a harsh, ugly laugh. You poisoned him against us. You filled his head with lies while he was weak and sick. This diary is just more of your manipulation. We have witnesses, Ruth. People who saw how you controlled him, who saw how you kept us away. A cold trickle of dread dripped down my spine. Witnesses? Who? Were there people in our life, people I had considered friends, who would perjure themselves for Mark and Simon? You're lying, I said, but a thread of uncertainty had woven itself into my resolve. Am I? He sneered. We'll see. We're not dropping this. We're going to fight you in that courtroom until you have nothing left. We're going to drag your name through the mud so thoroughly you'll have to move to another state. You will be utterly, completely alone. When we're done, you won't have a friend left in this world. The threat was designed to isolate me, to make me feel the very fear I was now beginning to feel. He was trying to make the world small and hostile, with me at its center. You're welcome to try, Mark, I said, and ended the call. My hand was trembling again. I set the phone down and turned to face my aunties. He says they have witnesses, I told them, my voice barely a whisper. People who will say I isolated David, that I manipulated him. Grace immediately came to my side, wrapping an arm around me. He's bluffing, Ruth. He has to be. Who would do such a thing? Clara, however, looked thoughtful, her brow furrowed. He's not entirely bluffing, she said, her tone pragmatic. He's a salesman, he's charismatic. And there are always people who are easily swayed, who enjoy drama, or who hold a secret grudge. He could have poisoned the well with some of Swade. Your mutual acquaintances. The idea was devastating. The thought of people I'd shared meals with, laughed with, now being recruited as weapons against me. It was a deeper, more intimate betrayal. So what do we do? I asked, feeling the walls closing in again. We do what people have done since the beginning of time when under siege, Clara declared. We circle the wagons. We gather our tribe. You need to know who is for you, and who is against you. And you need to do it now, before Mark's poison has time to spread. How? You start making calls, she said, not to everyone. To the key people, the ones whose opinion matters to you. You tell them your side of the story, simply and honestly, before they hear a twisted version from Mark. The idea filled me with a fresh wave of anxiety. It felt so exposing. To lay my raw, legal troubles at the feet of friends, to essentially ask them to choose a side. I can't, I protested. It's too humiliating. It is not humiliating to tell the truth. Clara's voice was sharp, a whip crack in the quiet kitchen. What is humiliating is allowing liars to define you. You have done nothing wrong. You are the victim here. Start acting like it. You need an army, Ruth, not just 2 old aunties and a lawyer. You need a community to stand with you, to support you, to be your character witnesses when the time comes. Grace squeezed my shoulder. She's right, honey. You need to let people in. You've been trying to carry this all by yourself, and you don't have to. I looked from Grace's compassionate face to Clara's determined one. They were my foundation. But Clara was right. A foundation alone isn't a house. You need walls, a roof, people to fill the rooms. My first call was the hardest. I called Sarah and Ben, our neighbors for 15 years. We'd had countless block parties, borrowed cups of sugar, watched each other's houses during vacations. Ben and David had often stood at the property line, talking about baseball and lawn care. Sarah answered, her voice bright. Ruth, how are you holding up, sweetie? The genuine concern in her voice almost broke me. Sarah, I'm okay, but I need to tell you something. Something difficult. I gave her the abbreviated, unvarnished version. The contest of the will, the allegations, and then the discovery of the hidden will and diary. I told her about David's words, his fear of his brothers, the money they had taken. There was a long silence on the other end. I braced for pity, for awkwardness, for disbelief. "Those sons of bitches," Sarah finally said, her voice low and furious. "I always knew there was something off about them. All that back-slapping bonhomie, but their eyes were always calculating. Ben is right here. He's livid. You listen to me, Ruth Wright. You are not in this alone. We are here for you. Whatever you need. If you need us to stand up in court and tell the judge what a wonderful, loving wife you were to David, we will be there. You tell that lawyer of yours to put us on the list." Tears of gratitude welled in my eyes. "Thank you, Sarah. You don't know what that means to me." "Nonsense," she said firmly. "That's what community is for." Emboldened, I made the next call. And the next. I called Maggie, my oldest friend from my publishing days. I called Frank, David's former business partner who had retired a few years earlier. With each call, I rehearsed the same painful story. And with each call, I was met not with judgment but with outrage and unwavering support. Maggie offered to come stay with me for a week. Frank, his voice shaking with anger, said, "David told me they were leeches. I should have done more. Tell your lawyer I have records, emails." David vented to me about them for years. My tribe was gathering. They were calling others, creating a network of support that stretched far beyond my kitchen. The phone began to ring with calls of encouragement, offers of help, messages of love. The world, which Mark had tried to make small and hostile, was suddenly large and full of allies. The final, most difficult call was to David's elderly aunt, Eleanor, his mother's sister. She was in her 80s, sharp as a tack, and had never been particularly fond of Mark and Simon. I was terrified of causing her more pain. I told her the story, as gently as I could. She listened without interruption. When I finished, she let out a long, weary sigh. "I'm not surprised, my dear. Not surprised at all. Their father, God rest his soul, was a wonderful man, but he was too soft on those boys. They were given everything and earned nothing. They've always felt the world owed them. David was different. He was his mother's son, kind, but with a backbone of steel." She paused. "This diary, it breaks my heart. But I am glad he had you, Ruth. He trusted you with his final truth. That is the greatest gift he could have given you. You fight them with everything you have. And you tell them their old Aunt Eleanor knows exactly what they are." When I hung up, I was emotionally drained, but the hollow feeling was gone. In its place was a solid, humming core of strength. I looked around the room at Grace and Clara. The house no longer felt like a lonely fortress under siege. It felt like a command center, a place of warmth and strategy. Clara nodded, a look of grim satisfaction on her face. "Good. Now they know they're not just fighting you. They're fighting all of us. An army of truth against a handful of lies." I realized then that Mark's greatest miscalculation wasn't legal. It was human. He had assumed I was alone. He had forgotten that a life built on love and integrity, like the one David and I had built, creates bonds that are not easily broken. He had money and lawyers on his side. But I had a tribe. And as I stood there, surrounded by the love of my aunties and the echoing support of my friends, I knew, with a certainty that went deeper than any legal document, that my tribe would win. The support of my tribe was a warm cloak against the coming storm, but the storm itself arrived with the impersonal chill of official documentation. 2 days after my conversation with Mark, a process server appeared on my doorstep. He was a young man with a bored expression, and he handed me a thick, heavy envelope. "Documents for Ruth Wright," he said flatly, before turning and walking away. The weight of the envelope felt ominous in my hands. I carried it to the kitchen table, my sanctuary-turned-war room, where Grace and Clara were waiting. Grace had brought over a fresh coffee cake, a nervous habit of hers, and the scent of cinnamon and sugar did little to cut the tension. "Here we go," I said, my voice quiet. I slid the contents out onto the table. It was the formal response from Bernstein and Crow to our motion for summary judgment. It was not, as Henderson had hoped, a surrender. It was a declaration of all-out war. Clara, her reading glasses perched on her nose, pulled the stack of papers toward her. She skimmed the dense legalese, her lips moving silently. Grace hovered behind her, wringing a dish towel in her hands. "Well?" I asked, unable to bear the silence. "What does it say?" Clara looked up, her face a mask of cold fury. "They are calling David a liar and you a forger." "What?" Grace gasped. "Listen to this," Clara said, her voice trembling with a rage she rarely showed. She read aloud, her tone dripping with contempt. "The document purported to be a last will and testament of David Wright is a transparent forgery, created by the respondent, Ruth Wright, in a desperate and criminal attempt to defraud the decedent's lawful heirs. The attached diary is a work of fiction, a post-mortem character assassination crafted to legitimize her theft. The petitioners, Mark and Simon Wright, were present at the execution of their brother's true and final will and attest to his sound mind and clear intention to provide for his blood relatives." The air left my lungs. The sheer brazen audacity of it was staggering. They weren't just disputing the will, they were accusing me of a crime. They were trying to reframe the entire narrative, painting David's own words as my malicious invention. "There's more," Clara continued, her eyes scanning down the page. "They list their witnesses. A nurse from the hospice service, a Cynthia Albright, who claims you were aggressively controlling of David's medication and access to visitors. And Frank Durning." "No," I whispered, sinking into a chair. "Not Frank. Frank, David's old partner. The one who had just days ago offered me his records and his support." "Are you sure it's the same Frank?" Grace asked, her face pale. "It says Frank Durning, former business partner of the decedent," Clara confirmed. "They have a signed affidavit from him, stating that David was, and I quote, often paranoid and distrustful in his business dealings, and that he expressed unfounded concerns about his brother's financial acumen." Betrayal, sharp and acidic, burned in my throat. Frank, the man David had trusted for 2 decades. The man who had called me, voice shaking with anger, offering his help. Had it all been an act? Had he been playing both sides? Or had Mark gotten to him, twisting his words, applying some kind of pressure I couldn't imagine? "This is a nightmare," I breathed, my head in my hands. "They're going to tear David apart. They're going to call him paranoid and unstable to make me look like a criminal." "Which is exactly what they want you to think," Clara said, slapping the document down on the table. "They want you to feel overwhelmed, outgunned. They want you to look at these lies and give up. This is not evidence, Ruth. This is theater. It's a performance for the judge, designed to create enough factual dispute to prevent a summary judgment and force a full, public, and expensive trial." My phone rang. It was Charles Henderson. I put it on speaker, my hands still trembling. "Ruth," he said, his voice grim. "I take it you've seen their response." "We're looking at it now," I said, my own voice thin. "Despicable, but not entirely unexpected," he said. "This is their only play. They cannot win on the facts, so they must create a cloud of doubt. The nurse is a problem. We will need to depose her, find out what Mark promised her, or what she misinterpreted. As for Frank Durning," he sighed, "that is a more significant blow. His testimony, if it stands, directly counters the narrative of the diary. What do we do?" I asked, feeling the solid ground I'd been standing on beginning to turn to quicksand. "We fight fire with an inferno," Henderson said, his tone shifting to one of fierce determination. "We do not retreat, we accelerate. I am scheduling depositions for next week. We will depose Mark. We will depose Simon. And we will depose Frank Durning. We will put them under oath, in a room, and we will tear their stories apart. We will also file a motion for sanctions against Bernstein and Crow for bringing a frivolous, bad faith lawsuit. We will argue that this entire exercise is a continuation of the financial abuse David wrote about. And the summary judgment? I asked. The hearing is still on, he said. But the judge will be less likely to rule in our favor outright with these disputed facts on the table. Our goal now is to use the depositions to show the judge that these disputes are manufactured, that their witnesses are not credible. We make our case in the deposition room first, so that by the time we get to the hearing, the judge sees their response for the charade it is. After I hung up with Henderson, a heavy silence fell over the kitchen. The warm, supportive atmosphere from the day before had been shattered. The battle was no longer a theoretical future event. It was here, in these pages, with its accusations and its betrayals. I need to see him, I said suddenly, standing up. I need to see Frank. Grace looked alarmed. Ruth, is that wise? He's their witness now. All the more reason, I said, a desperate energy taking hold of me. I need to look him in the eye. I need to know why. Clara studied me for a long moment, then gave a curt nod. Good. Face your enemy. But you're not going alone. 20 minutes later, the three of us stood on the pristine porch of Frank Durning's colonial-style house. He and his wife, Carol, had hosted countless dinner parties here. David and I had laughed in this very spot. Frank answered the door himself. He looked older than the last time I'd seen him, his face drawn and pale. When he saw me, and then Clara and Grace behind me, his eyes widened in shock and a flush of guilt crept up his neck. Ruth, he stammered. This isn't a good time. It never is, Frank, I said, my voice cold. I just got served with your affidavit. He had the decency to look down at his feet. Ruth, you have to understand. It's not what it looks like. Then what is it, Frank? I asked, stepping forward, my grief and anger giving me a courage I didn't know I possessed. David considered you his best friend. He trusted you. He told you things he didn't even tell me. And now you're going to stand in a court of law and call him paranoid. To help his brothers steal from his widow? It's not like that, he insisted, his voice rising. Mark came to see me. He showed me things. Financial records from the business. He said David had been making bad decisions for years, that he was becoming erratic, that he was siphoning money away because of some irrational fear. He said you were encouraging it. And you believed him? The words were a whisper of pure disbelief. You, who work side by side with David for 20 years? You believe the two men he explicitly warned you about? Frank's shoulders slumped. He looked over his shoulder, into the dark house, then back at me, his eyes pleading. Carol, she's been sick. The medical bills. Mark, he made me an offer. A generous one. For my silence, for my interpretation of a few past conversations. He said if I didn't, they'd sue me too, for my share of the old business, drag my name through the mud. I couldn't risk it, Ruth. I have a sick wife to care for. There it was. Not a twisted belief, but a simple, ugly transaction. Mark had found his pressure point and applied it. Frank had chosen his wife's security over his friend's legacy and my well-being. It was a betrayal, but it was a human one, a cowardly, devastatingly human one. I looked at him, this broken man on his expensive porch, and I felt my anger shift into something else, a profound, weary pity. David's diary mentions you, Frank, I said softly. He wrote about how much he valued your counsel, how you were the only one who understood the pressure he was under from his brothers. He called you his anchor. Tears welled in Frank's eyes. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. You've made your choice, I said, my voice firm now, all uncertainty gone. You've chosen to side with the men who stole from your friend while he was dying. You will have to live with that. But know this, we are going to win. And when we do, everyone will know what you did. I turned and walked away, my aunties falling into step beside me. I didn't look back, I didn't need to. The image of Frank's shattered, guilty face was burned into my memory. We drove home in silence. The legal gauntlet had been thrown down. They had brought their lies and their bribes and their betrayals. But they had also, in their desperation, shown me their true, rotten core. They had shown me that their case was built not on truth, but on sand, the sand of a bribed nurse and a coerced friend. As I walked back into my house, I didn't feel defeated. I felt focused. The path ahead was ugly, but it was clear. We would meet them in the deposition room. We would meet them in the courtroom. And we would expose them, one lie at a time. The war was no longer about inheritance. It was about legacy. It was about ensuring that David's truth was the one that endured, and for that I would walk through any gauntlet they could devise. The days that followed were a masterclass in psychological warfare. Mark and Simon, realizing their legal strategy was a house of cards, began a campaign of personal destruction. It was the nasty gossip Mark had promised, but weaponized and unleashed with a viciousness I could never have anticipated. It started subtly. A cold shoulder from a woman I knew from the library at the grocery store. A neighbor quickly crossing the street when she saw me coming. Then, the anonymous letter arrived. It was typed on plain paper, with no return address. Everyone knows what you are. A gold-digging whore who preyed on a sick man. Give the money back to his real family before you get what's coming to you. I read it standing by the mailbox, the sun-warmed metal of the box feeling like a brand against my leg. The words didn't feel like they were written about me. They felt like something from a bad movie, but the intent was real. It was designed to terrify, to isolate, to make me feel like a target in my own community. I showed it to Clara. Her face hardened, but she didn't seem surprised. "They're rats," she said, folding the letter and putting it in a plastic bag. "This is what rats do. They scurry in the shadows and spread disease. We give this to Henderson. It shows a pattern of harassment." The next blow was more public. I received a Facebook message from a distant cousin. "Ruth, I'm so sorry to see this. Is it true?" Attached was a link to a local community forum website, the kind that was a cesspool of local grievances and conspiracy theories. There, under a thread titled "Local Widow and Inheritance Scandal," was a post from an anonymous user. It laid out a twisted version of events, painting me as a scheming second wife who had alienated David from his devoted brothers. It claimed I had a history of financial instability and that my own family had disowned me. The comments were a feeding frenzy of outrage, people who had never met me, calling me a vulture and a sinner. I felt the blood drain from my face. This was Mark's work. I knew it with every fiber of my being. He was a salesman. He knew how to sell a narrative, even a false one. He was poisoning the well, ensuring that even if I won in court, I would lose in the court of public opinion. The most painful moment came a few days later. I was working in the garden, trying to find solace in the simple, honest work of pulling weeds, when a car pulled up. It was the daughter of one of David's and my oldest friends, a young woman named Chloe whom I'd known since she was a baby. She got out, but she didn't approach the house. She just stood by her car, looking at me with an expression of profound disappointment. "Chloe," I said, getting to my feet, brushing the dirt from my knees. "I just came from Uncle Mark's," she said, her voice tight. "He showed me the papers, Ruth. He's devastated. He and Simon just want what's fair. They just want to honor their brother's true wishes. How could you do this to them? After everything they've been through?" I felt the world tilt. Mark had gotten to her. He had played the grieving uncle, the victim, and he had recruited the next generation to his cause. "Chloe, what he showed you isn't the whole story," I said, my voice pleading. "There's another will. A diary. David wanted to protect me from them." She shook her head, her eyes welling with tears. "He said you'd say that. He said you fabricated it. I can't believe it. I looked up to you." She got back in her car and drove away, leaving me standing alone in my garden, the turned earth feeling like a freshly dug grave. That was the price of truth. The truth, it turned out, was a fragile thing, easily drowned out by a louder, more sensational lie. The truth required context, nuance, evidence. The lie was simple, emotional, and salacious. It spread faster. I retreated into the house, the walls feeling thin and permeable. The support of my tribe was still there. Sarah called every day. Maggie sent funny memes to my phone. Auntie Grace showed up with endless casseroles, but the attacks from the outside were taking their toll. I stopped sleeping. I jumped at every noise. I found myself second-guessing every interaction, wondering who believed the lies and who believed me. The weight of it was crushing me. I was trying to grieve my husband while simultaneously defending his memory and my own character from a sustained, malicious assault. I was living in a funhouse mirror where I was the villain in a story I hadn't written. One evening I broke. The three of us were watching a mindless game show on television, a desperate attempt at normalcy, when a commercial for a local law firm came on. Injured in an accident. You need a fighter on your side. Something about the word fighter snapped something inside me. The carefully constructed dam of my composure shattered. I began to cry, not the quiet tears of grief I was used to, but great, heaving sobs that racked my entire body. It was a torrent of pain, of fear, of exhaustion, of the sheer, unbearable weight of being hated for a crime I didn't commit. Grace was at my side in an instant, holding me, rocking me, murmuring, "Let it out, my girl, just let it all out." Clara muted the television and sat in the chair opposite me, waiting. She didn't try to shush me or offer platitudes. She let me fall completely apart. When the storm of sobs finally subsided into ragged hiccups, I looked at her, my face raw and swollen. "I can't do this, Clara," I choked out. "I can't. It's too hard. They're everywhere. They're turning everyone against me. Maybe I should just take their offer. Give them the money. I just want it to stop. I just want to be left alone, to miss my husband." Grace held me tighter. "Oh, honey, no." Clara leaned forward, her steely eyes locking with mine. "Listen to me, Ruth. Listen carefully. What you are feeling is exactly what they want you to feel. This is the price they are demanding for the truth. They are making it so expensive, so painful, that they hope you will decide it's not worth the cost. They want you to surrender because you are tired of the fight." She stood up and began to pace, a caged tiger in my living room. "But you must understand something. If you surrender now, you are not just giving them money. You are giving them David's legacy. You are validating their lies. You are admitting that he was a fool who was manipulated by his wife, and that his own written words are worthless. You will be confirming their narrative for the rest of your life. Is that the price you are willing to pay? Your peace, in exchange for your husband's honor?" Her words were like a bucket of ice water. I saw it with terrifying clarity. It wasn't about the money. It hadn't been for a long time. It was about the story that would be told about David, about me, about our life together. If I gave up, Mark and Simon's version would become the official record. David would be the poor, duped brother, and I would be the villainous widow. I thought of David's diary. "I have to protect us." He had borne the weight of this knowledge to protect me. Now, it was my turn to bear the weight of this fight to protect him. I wiped my face with the heels of my hands, my breath still hitching. "No," I said, my voice hoarse but firm. "No, it's not." Clara stopped pacing and nodded, a look of fierce pride in her eyes. "Good. Then this?" She gestured at my tear-streaked face, at the anonymous letter in its bag on the table. "This is just the cost of doing business. This is the toll the truth charges to cross the bridge of lies. You pay it, you acknowledge the pain, and then you keep walking." I took a deep, shuddering breath. The crying jag had purged something toxic from my system. The fear and exhaustion were still there, but they were no longer in control. They were just passengers on this journey, not the drivers. The price of truth was high. It cost me sleep, it cost me peace, it cost me the good opinion of people like Chloe and Frank. But as I sat there, surrounded by the two women who would walk through fire for me, I knew it was a price I was willing to pay. David's truth was worth it. My truth was worth it. And no amount of anonymous letters or poisoned gossip could change that. The gauntlet was brutal, but I was still standing, and I would continue to stand, no matter the cost. The conference room at Henderson and Gray was a chamber of cold modern elegance, all polished granite and harsh, recessed lighting. It felt like an operating theater, a place for clinical, precise dissection. On one side of the long, obsidian table sat Charles Henderson and me. On the other, Mark and Simon, flanked by their attorney, a sleek, predatory man named Robert Crow from Bernstein and Crow. A court reporter sat at the head of the table, her fingers poised over her stenography machine, her face a blank slate. This was the deposition. The legal gauntlet had led here, to this sterile room where words would become weapons and truth would be tested under oath. Mark looked smug, leaning back in his chair as if he owned the place. Simon looked pale and nervous, his eyes darting around the room, avoiding mine. Robert Crow had a thin, condescending smile permanently etched on his lips. Henderson had warned me. A deposition is not a trial, Ruth. There is no judge here to object to badgering. Crow will try to rattle you, to get you to say something inconsistent. Your only jobs are to tell the truth, to answer only the question asked, and to never, ever volunteer information. If you need a break, you take it. This is a marathon, not a sprint. They started with me. Robert Crow stood and began pacing slowly behind his clients, a panther circling its prey. Mrs. Wright, he began, his voice smooth as oil. Let's establish the nature of your relationship with the decedent. You were, in fact, his second wife, is that correct? The implication was clear. You were the replacement. I was David's wife, I said, my voice clear. And how would you characterize your husband's mental state in the months leading up to his diagnosis? He was the same man I had always known. Sharp, thoughtful, and deeply intelligent. Really? Crow feigned surprise. So you noticed no changes, no forgetfulness, no confusion regarding financial matters? No. Paranoia? I kept my gaze steady. I noticed a man who was under a great deal of stress from his brother's constant demands for money and involvement in his business. Crow's smile tightened. Objection. Non-responsive. He was speaking to the court reporter, for the record. I'm simply answering your question about his state of mind, I said calmly. The pressure from his brothers was a significant factor. He moved on, trying to trip me up on dates, on the specifics of David's medication, on who visited and when. He kept circling back to the idea of control, of isolation. Each time, I answered factually, without emotion, anchoring my responses in the reality I had lived. I could feel Henderson's quiet approval beside me. Then, Crow picked up a copy of the diary. Let's talk about this document you claim your husband wrote, this dramatic little journal. You expect this court to believe that a busy, successful man like David Wright spent his evenings scribbling down his innermost thoughts like a teenage girl. Henderson spoke for the first time, his voice a low rumble. Objection, argumentative, I'll rephrase, Crow said, not missing a beat. When did you first become aware of this diary's existence? When I found it in his lockbox after his death. And the lockbox. The combination was the number of your house, is that right? How very convenient. It was the number of our house, I corrected. The home we built together. It held significance for him. Of course it did, Crow said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. He spent the next hour insinuating that I had written the diary myself, that I had studied David's handwriting, that I had planted it as the ultimate piece of evidence in my elaborate scheme. He tried to make the profound love and fear in those pages sound like a cheap plot device. I held fast, the memory of finding the box, the shock of reading David's words, my anchor in the storm of his accusations. Finally, it was over. Crow sat down, looking faintly disappointed that he hadn't broken me. I was exhausted, but intact. "Your witness, Mr. Henderson," Crow said dismissively. Henderson didn't stand. He simply leaned forward slightly, his hands folded on the table. "Just one question, Mrs. Wright. Did you forge this diary or this will?" "No," I said, looking directly at Mark and Simon. "I did not, thank you." No further questions. Then it was Mark's turn. He swaggered to the witness chair, oozing a confidence that felt brittle under the bright lights. Henderson began his questioning softly, almost conversationally. "Mr. Wright, you describe yourself and your brother as being very close to David, is that right?" "Of course," Mark said, spreading his hands. "We were brothers. Thick as thieves. Yet, in the last 5 years of his life, how many times did you socialize with David and Ruth outside of major holidays?" Mark shifted in his seat. "I don't recall an exact number. We were all busy. Would it surprise you to learn that, based on Ruth's calendar and testimony from mutual friends, the number was fewer than 10 times? That can't be right." Mark blustered. "We talked all the time." "About what?" Henderson asked mildly. "Business, family, the usual." "Let's talk about business." Henderson opened a file. "Are you familiar with a business operating account numbered 4881XB? The air in the room went out. Mark's smugness evaporated. Simon looked like he was going to be sick. Robert Crow leaned forward. "Objection, relevance. It goes directly to the petitioner's credibility and their alleged close relationship with the decedent," Henderson said, his voice still calm. "I'll allow it," the court reporter said, speaking for the record. Henderson turned back to Mark. "The account, Mr. Wright?" Mark cleared his throat. I believe that was one of David's business accounts. One that you and your brother had signatory authority on, correct? A temporary measure, while he was ill." Henderson slid a sheet of paper across the table. "This is a transfer record from that account, dated 8 months before David's diagnosis, for $50,000 to an entity called Wright Holdings, LLC. Can you tell me what Wright Holdings is?" Mark's eyes darted toward Crow. "It's a family investment vehicle." "And who are the principals of Wright Holdings?" "Myself and Simon." "So," Henderson said, steepling his fingers, "you transferred $50,000 from your sick brother's business account to your own personal company. For what purpose?" "It was a loan," Mark insisted, his voice rising. "He authorized it for a real estate venture." "Where is the documentation for this loan? The promissory note? The repayment schedule?" "It was between brothers. We didn't need all that." Henderson let the silence hang in the room, heavy and accusatory. He then proceeded to go through each transfer listed in the diary, one by one. With each question, Mark's answers became more evasive, more defensive. The polished salesman was gone, replaced by a cornered man squirming under the light. He contradicted himself. He blamed David for being secretive. He claimed I had poisoned David against them, but could provide no specific instance, only vague assertions. When Henderson was done, Mark was flushed and sweating. The image of the devoted, wrong brother had been shattered, replaced by the picture of a man who had been systematically helping himself to his brother's assets. Then it was Simon's turn. He was a wreck before he even sat down. Henderson didn't need to be aggressive. He just had to lead Simon through the same series of questions. "Simon, did you know about the account 4881XB? "Yes," Simon whispered, his head bowed. "Did you benefit from the transfers made from that account?" Mark said it was for the family, that it was our money anyway." "Your money?" Henderson asked, his voice gentle. "Did David ever tell you that his assets were your money?" Simon looked like a trapped animal. He glanced at Mark, who was glaring at him, then back at Henderson. "No," he mumbled. "Speak up for the record, please." "No," Simon said a little louder. "He didn't. Did you ever see your brother David exhibit paranoia or mental instability before his illness?" Simon was crying now, silent tears tracking down his face. "No. He was just tired of us asking for money." It was a devastating, simple confession. Robert Crow looked furious. Mark looked like he wanted to strangle his younger brother. The final witness of the day was Frank Durning, called by Henderson to expose the coercion. Frank looked ancient, his shoulders slumped. Henderson walked him through his affidavit. "Mr. Durning, you state here that David was often paranoid. Can you give the court a specific example of this paranoia?" Frank shifted uncomfortably. He was just suspicious of people's motives. Whose motives? His brother's, mostly. So, Henderson said, his suspicion of the two men who were, as we've established today, transferring large sums of money from his accounts without documentation. That is your example of his paranoia. Frank had no answer. He just stared at the table. "Mr. Durning, did Mark Wright offer you money in exchange for this affidavit?" Crow shot to his feet. "Objection, privileged." But the damage was done. The question hung in the air, and Frank's guilty, panicked expression was all the answer anyone in the room needed. When the deposition finally adjourned, the atmosphere was utterly transformed. Mark stormed out of the room without a backward glance. Simon scurried after him. Robert Crow gathered his papers with stiff, angry movements. I sat in my chair, physically and emotionally drained, but filled with a profound, quiet certainty. I had looked my accusers in the eye. I had seen their lies unravel under the simple weight of questions. I had watched the facade of family devotion crumble to reveal the ugly greed at its core. Henderson placed a hand on my shoulder. "It's over," he said quietly. "We won, they know it. Crow knows it. The summary judgment is a formality now. No judge will look at this transcript and see anything but a predatory, groundless lawsuit built on lies and theft." I nodded, unable to speak. The price had been high, but in this sterile, silent room, watching Mark and Simon's house of cards collapse, it felt worth it. The truth had been spoken into the record. It was now a matter of law. David's voice, through his diary and through the devastatingly simple questions of his lawyer, had finally been heard. The week following the depositions was the strangest of my life. It was a silence, but not the heavy, waiting silence that had plagued me before. This was a deep, resonant quiet, like the air after a terrible storm has passed. The phone didn't ring with threats or anonymous taunts. No new legal documents appeared at my door. The online gossip thread mysteriously disappeared. It was as if a switch had been flipped. The siege was over. The army outside the gates had packed up and gone home in the dead of night. Henderson called to confirm it. "I've had back-channel communications with Crow," he said, a note of satisfaction in his voice. "They are desperate to settle. They will drop everything, the will contest, all claims, in exchange for us not pursuing criminal charges for the forged transfer authorizations and for dropping our motion for sanctions against them. They want this to go away quietly." I stood in my kitchen, the morning sun warm on my face, and listened. "What do you advise?" "I advise we take it," Henderson said. "A trial would be a costly spectacle, and while I am confident we would win, it would prolong your pain. This way, it ends, cleanly. Finally, the will is upheld, the estate is yours." And they slink away with their tails between their legs, knowing they were caught and exposed. The word finally echoed in the quiet house. It was what I had wanted for so long, an end. And yet. "And the diary?" I asked. "David's name?" "They called him a liar and a paranoid. They called me a forger. That doesn't just disappear. The court record will reflect that their claims were withdrawn because they were without merit." Henderson said, "For anyone who looks, the truth is there. For everyone else, you have the victory. You have your life back." I thanked him and told him I needed to think. I hung up and walked to the back porch, looking out at the oak tree. It was mid-autumn now, and its leaves were a brilliant, fiery gold. David had always loved this time of year. The calm felt unnerving. For months, my entire existence had been defined by the fight. Every thought, every action, every breath was filtered through the lens of the lawsuit. Now, with the fight suddenly gone, I felt unmoored. What was I without this battle to fight? Who was I, if not David's defender? Auntie Grace came over later that morning, bearing, as always, food. This time it was a quiche. "For a peaceful breakfast," she said, her smile warm and knowing. I told her about the settlement offer. She clapped her hands together. "Oh, Ruth, that's wonderful. It's over, is it?" I asked, slicing the quiche. "It feels anticlimactic. After all that. The lies, the betrayal, they just get to walk away. They don't have to apologize. They don't have to admit what they did. They just get to pretend it never happened." Grace put her hand over mine. "My dear, what did you want? A parade? Their admission of guilt won't change what happened. This ending, it's a blessing. It gives you your future back." I knew she was right, logically. But my heart felt strangely cheated. When Clara arrived an hour later, her perspective was, as always, different. I told her the news. "Humph," she grunted, taking a seat at the kitchen table. "So, they cut and run. Typical. They want it to go away quietly," I said. "Of course they do," Clara replied. "They're embarrassed. They were exposed as the greedy, conniving little weasels they are. A public trial would have been their utter humiliation. This way, they can tell their little circle that they settled to avoid dragging their brother's name through the mud or some other self-serving nonsense." "And David's name?" I asked, voicing my core concern to the person I knew would understand it best. Clara fixed me with her sharp gaze. "David's name is clear. It's in the court record. It's in his diary, which is now a legal exhibit. It's in the fact that you won. The people who matter know the truth. The people who believe Mark's version were never your people to begin with. You cannot control the narrative they spin in their own pathetic little echo chamber. You can only control your own life." Her words were the anchor I needed. She was right. A dramatic, public verdict wouldn't have healed the wound any faster. In fact, it might have kept it raw and open for longer. This quiet, unequivocal victory was its own kind of justice. It was the justice of them being forced to retreat, of their legal bill being for nothing, of them knowing, in their hearts, that they had lost. The calm was not the prelude to another storm. It was the aftermath. It was the space to rebuild. That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done in months. I got in my car and I drove to the botanical gardens. David and I had loved it there. I walked the familiar paths, alone. The chrysanthemums were in full, glorious bloom, explosions of copper and burgundy and gold. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and dying leaves. For the first time since David's death, I wasn't thinking about wills or depositions or betrayals. I was just walking. I noticed the intricate pattern of a spider web jeweled with dew. I watched a squirrel frantically bury a nut. I felt the sun on my skin and the solid ground beneath my feet. I found our favorite bench, overlooking a quiet pond. I sat down, and I let myself miss him. Not the him of the lawsuit or the him of his illness, but the him of this bench. The him who would hold my hand and point out the way the light hit the water. The grief came, but it was a clean grief, untainted by anger or fear. It was just love, with nowhere to go. And in that calm, I began to remember who I was. I was Ruth. I was a reader. A gardener. A woman who loved quiet mornings and bad puns. I was the person David had fallen in love with, not because I was a fighter, but because I was me. The fight had changed me, yes. It had carved new lines of resilience on my heart. It had taught me to recognize sand when I thought I was standing on stone. But it wasn't the whole of me. It was a chapter, A terrible, dramatic chapter, but the story was not over. When I returned home, the house felt different. It was no longer a fortress or a command center. It was just my house. Our house. It was waiting for me to fill it with a new life. I called Charles Henderson. "Tell them we accept their offer," I said, my voice steady and sure. "On one condition. They sign a mutual non-disparagement clause. They are never to speak publicly about David, me, or the details of this case again." Henderson chuckled. "I'll make it a central term of the agreement." "Well done, Ruth." I hung up the phone. It was over. Truly over. That night, Grace and Clara came over for a quiet dinner. We didn't talk about the lawsuit. We talked about books. We talked about Grace's rose bushes. We talked about Clara's plans to repaint her kitchen. It was normal. It was peaceful. Later, as I lay in bed, the full weight of the calm settled over me. The storm had passed. The landscape of my life was altered, scarred in places, but it was still my land. And for the first time in a very, very long time, I looked toward the horizon, not with dread, but with a flicker of something I barely recognized. It was hope. The storm was over, and I was still standing. Now, it was time to learn how to live in the sunshine again. The settlement should have been the end. The papers were drafted, the terms agreed upon. Mark and Simon would slink away, and I would be left in peace. But some people, when cornered, would rather burn the whole house down than admit they were ever in the wrong. Pride is a poison, and it had seeped too deep into Mark's bones. Charles Henderson called, his voice uncharacteristically tense. "Ruth, we have a problem. They've rejected the settlement." I was wiping down the kitchen counter, the simple, mundane act a newfound pleasure. The sponge froze in my hand. "What? Why?" "Mark," Henderson said, the name a sigh of exasperation. "He's insisting on his day in court. Crow is trying to rein him in, but Mark is the client. He's convinced he can win, that he can charm a judge. He's calling the settlement a capitulation and refuses to sign. He says if we want our victory, we have to take it from him in front of a judge." The calm of the past week shattered like glass. The respite had been just that, a brief pause, not a conclusion. My knees felt weak, and I leaned against the counter for support. "So what happens now?" "Now," Henderson said, his voice hardening into the steel I'd come to rely on. "We give him exactly what he's asking for. The summary judgment hearing is tomorrow. We go to court, we present our case. And we let a judge publicly dismantle him." The county courthouse was a monument to stern authority, all granite pillars and echoing marble hallways. It smelled of old wood, floor polish, and a faint, metallic tang of anxiety. I walked between Henderson and Clara, a fortress of a woman in her most severe black suit. Grace, too nervous for the drama of the courtroom, was waiting as a supportive presence at my house. We entered the courtroom. It was smaller than I'd imagined, more intimate, and therefore more terrifying. The judge's bench loomed like a cliff face. The spectator gallery was empty save for a few bored-looking individuals dealing with their own private calamities. And there, at the plaintiff's table, sat Mark and Simon with Robert Crow. Mark looked smug, dressed in a too-sharp suit, believing this was his stage. Simon looked like he was attending his own execution. We took our seats. My heart was a frantic bird beating against my ribs. This was it, the final, public reckoning. The bailiff called out, "All rise for the Honorable Judge Irene Moore." The judge who entered was a woman in her late 60s, with a cap of silver hair and a face that looked as if it had been carved from granite. She moved with an economy of motion, her black robes swirling around her. She did not look like someone who would suffer fools. "Be seated," she said, her voice crisp and clear. She surveyed the room, her gaze lingering for a moment on Mark's preening confidence before moving to Henderson and me. "We're here on the matter of the estate of David Wright. Petitioner's motion to contest the will, respondent's motion for summary judgment. Mr. Crow, you may begin." Robert Crow stood, oozing a synthetic confidence. He launched into his well-rehearsed narrative: the vulnerable, sick brother, the isolating, manipulative wife, the suspicious, last-minute will and diary, so conveniently discovered. He painted a picture of a family torn apart by a scheming outsider. He was a performer, but his performance felt hollow in the quiet, serious room. "We have a witness, Your Honor," Crow concluded. Cynthia Albright, a hospice nurse who observed the respondent's controlling behavior firsthand. Judge Moore nodded. "Call your witness." Nurse Albright was a pinched-faced woman in her 50s. She took the stand and was sworn in. Under Crow's gentle prompting, she told her story: how I'd been overly involved in David's medication, how I'd limited visitors, how I'd seemed cold and distant. When Crow finished, Henderson stood. He didn't approach the witness stand. He simply stood by our table, his hands clasped behind his back. "Miss Albright," he began, his voice conversational, "how long were you assigned to Mr. Wright's care?" "About 3 weeks," she said. "And in that time, how many visits did the petitioners, Mark and Simon Wright, make?" She hesitated. I believe 2 or 3. And on those visits, did they bring their brother anything? A favorite food? A book? Did they sit and hold his hand, talk about old times?" I don't recall specifics." "What do you recall?" Henderson asked mildly. "They talked about business mostly. Money." "I see." Henderson paused. "Now, you described Mrs. Wright as controlling regarding medication. Could you describe the specific medication regimen for a patient with glioblastoma in its final stages?" Nurse Albright shifted in her seat. "It's complex. Pain management, anti-seizure, steroids. And is it not critical, life and death critical, that such a regimen be managed with absolute precision? That dosages are not missed, that interactions are avoided?" "Well, yes, of course." "So, a spouse, who is meticulous, who is present, who ensures her dying husband receives the correct medication at the correct time. Your professional opinion is that this is controlling behavior. Or is it the behavior of a devoted caregiver?" Nurse Albright flushed. I may have used the wrong word. Thank you. No further questions." She scurried from the stand, her testimony now seeming petty and malicious. Then it was Henderson's turn. He called no witnesses. Instead, he stood and addressed the judge. "Your Honor, the petitioner's case is a story. A compelling one, perhaps, but a story nonetheless. We are here today not for stories but for facts. And the facts are these." He held up the hidden will. "This is the last will and testament of David Wright, executed while he was in perfect health, witnessed and notarized. It explicitly disinherits his brothers due to their, and I quote, long-standing pattern of financial exploitation. This document alone renders their entire case moot." He then held up the diary. And this is David Wright's own contemporaneous record of that exploitation. It details, in his own hand, the pressure, the manipulation, the unauthorized transfers of funds from his business account to his brother's personal company transfers we have entered into evidence. He turned and looked directly at Mark. "The petitioners would have you believe this is a forgery, a criminal fabrication by a grieving widow. Yet they have produced no handwriting expert, no forensic evidence to support this outrageous claim. They have only the testimony of the very men accused within these pages." He turned back to the judge, his voice resonating with finality. "This is not a case about a will. It is a case about truth versus greed. The petitioners have abused the legal process in a final, desperate attempt to continue the financial abuse their brother sought to escape. They have no case. There are no material facts in dispute. Their lawsuit is, and always has been, a predatory farce. We ask the court to grant summary judgment, to uphold David Wright's true will, and to put an end to this charade." He sat down. The courtroom was utterly silent. Judge Moore's face was impassive. She turned to Robert Crow. "Your rebuttal, Mr. Crow?" Crow stood, but the slick confidence was gone. He was flustered. "Your Honor, the credibility of these documents is the central issue. My client's testimony, the nurse's testimony, it all creates a factual question for a jury to decide." Judge Moore leaned forward, her eyes like laser points. "Mr. Crow, I have read the deposition transcripts. I have seen the financial records. Your clients admitted under oath to transferring tens of thousands of dollars from their brother's accounts without documentation. The nurse's testimony has been shown to be a mischaracterization of basic caregiving. You are asking me to send this to a jury based on what? The speculative theory that a woman with no history of fraud suddenly became a master forger to create a diary that just so happens to accurately describe verifiable financial transactions. Is that the factual question you are referring to?" Crow opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked like a man who had just realized he'd let his clients off a cliff. Judge Moore didn't wait for an answer. "The court finds there are no genuine issues of material fact. The will presented by the respondent is valid and supersedes all others. The petition to contest the will is denied. The respondent's motion for summary judgment is granted. The estate of David Wright is awarded to the respondent, Ruth Wright, in its entirety." She brought the gavel down. Crack. The sound was as sharp and final as a gunshot. It was over. I looked across the aisle. Mark's face was a grotesque mask of shock and fury. All his bluster, his charm, his lies had meant nothing in this room of law. In fact, he had gotten his day in court, and it had annihilated him. Simon had his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Robert Crow was already shoveling papers into his briefcase, eager to be away from the scene of his professional humiliation. There were no cheers, no dramatic speeches. Just the simple, crushing weight of the law, delivered by a judge who had seen straight to the rotten core of it all. Henderson placed a steadying hand on my arm. "Let's go, Ruth," he said softly. We stood and walked out of the courtroom. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The image of Mark's shattered pride was etched into my memory, a more satisfying verdict than any I could have imagined. The courtroom stage had been set. Mark had demanded a performance, and in the end, the only role he got to play was the fool. We emerged from the courthouse into a pale autumn sunlight that felt brand new. The granite pillars no longer seemed intimidating. They felt like sentinels of justice. The crisp air was a balm. I took a deep, shuddering breath, the first one I felt I'd taken in a year. Charles Henderson turned to me, a rare, full smile on his face. "It's done, Ruth. It's truly done. The judge's ruling is unequivocal. There is no avenue for appeal. The estate is yours." I looked at him, this formidable man who had been my champion, my general. "Thank you, Charles, for everything." He shook my hand, his grip firm and final. It was an honor. David would be proud. With a nod to Clara, he walked away, his work complete. Clara and I stood on the courthouse steps for a moment, silent. The world was going about its business. Cars honked. People rushed by on the sidewalk, oblivious to the seismic shift that had just occurred in my small universe. "Well," Clara said, slipping her arm through mine. Her voice was thick with an emotion she rarely showed. "He laughed at the idea of you going to court. Let's see if he's laughing now." We drove home in a silence that was neither heavy nor anxious, but profoundly peaceful. The fight was over. The verdict was in. The truth had not just prevailed, it had been stamped, sealed, and delivered by the full authority of the law. When we pulled into the driveway, Grace was waiting on the porch, her face etched with worry. She must have seen the look on our faces, because her expression melted into one of tearful relief. She rushed down the steps and pulled me into a crushing hug. "You won," she whispered, her body shaking with sobs. "Oh, thank God, you won." We went inside, the three of us. The house felt different. The shadows that had lurked in the corners for months seemed to have been banished by the courtroom's stark light. It was just a house again. My house. I told them everything, the nurse's feeble testimony, Henderson's powerful, concise argument, the judge's scathing dismissal of Mark and Simon's case, the final, definitive crack of the gavel. She saw right through them, I said, sinking into my favorite armchair, a lifetime of tension draining from my body. She called their lawsuit a predatory farce. Grace brought out a bottle of champagne she'd been saving for a year. "We are celebrating," she declared, her tone brooking no argument. "Properly." As we clinked glasses, a part of me waited for the other shoe to drop. An angry phone call. A final, spiteful act, but nothing came. The verdict was a wall, and they had slammed into it at full speed. There was nothing left for them to do but nurse their wounds and their humiliation. The karma twist wasn't in some dramatic, poetic justice. It was in the quiet, absolute nature of their defeat. Mark, who lived for manipulation and performance, had been rendered a silent, bitter spectator in the story of his own downfall. Simon, the follower, had followed his brother right off a legal cliff. The money they had so desperately coveted was now forever beyond their reach, and they were left with astronomical legal bills and the public record of their own avarice. A few days later, the written judgment arrived in the mail. I opened it with steady hands. It was a dry, legal document, but I read every word. Judge Moore's ruling was even more blistering in print. She cited the blatant and unrepentant financial exploitation by the petitioners, the transparently manufactured claims of undue influence, and the brazen attempt to use this court to perpetrate a fraud upon the decedent's rightful heir. She awarded me not only the estate but also a portion of my legal fees, to be paid by Mark and Simon personally. It was a complete and total vindication. With the legal war over, the practical work began. With Henderson's team handling the probate, the assets were finally released to me. The life insurance, the investments, the title to the house, free and clear. The money from the hidden account, 4,881 XB, was traced and returned. It was a staggering amount, a sum that should have felt abstract, but it didn't. It felt like David's final, fierce act of protection. It was the fuel for the future he had wanted for me. I paid off the remaining mortgage. I set up secure investments for the long term. And I allowed myself to think, for the first time, about what I wanted. Not what I needed to do to survive, but what I truly wanted. The first thing I did was book a trip. Not the camper van tour of the coast that Dream was too intertwined with David to face just yet. Instead, I booked a small guided tour of Tuscany. I was going to see art, and drink wine, and walk through ancient hills. I was going to be a tourist in my own life again. The day before I left, I was in the garden, pulling the last of the summer's dead annuals. A car I didn't recognize pulled up slowly. My heart, trained for a year to jump at unfamiliar vehicles, gave a nervous flutter. The driver's side door opened, and Chloe, the daughter of our old friends, got out. She looked hesitant, wringing her hands. She walked up to the edge of the garden. "Ruth?" she said, her voice small. I stood up, brushing the dirt from my knees. "Hello, Chloe. I heard about the court." She couldn't meet my eyes. "My parents told me everything. The real everything. About the money they took. The diary. I'm so sorry. I should have come to you. I should have believed you. I was just so confused." Mark was so convincing. I looked at this young woman, who had been like a niece to me, and I felt no anger, only a deep, weary sadness for the damage Mark had wrought in so many directions. "He's a very convincing man, Chloe," I said softly. "He built his life on it." Tears filled her eyes. "Can you ever forgive me?" "There's nothing to forgive," I said, and I meant it. The fight had burned away my capacity for holding petty grudges. "You were caught in the crossfire. I'm just sorry you were hurt." She rushed forward then and hugged me, her body shaking with relieved sobs. "I missed you," she whispered. "I missed you too," I said, patting her back, and it was true. Her visit felt like the final seal on the verdict. It wasn't just a legal victory, it was a restoration. Piece by piece, the world that had been stolen from me was being given back. The next morning, I stood at my front door, suitcase in hand, ready to leave for the airport. I looked back into the house, our house. It was quiet, filled with golden morning light. It was no longer a monument to grief or a fortress under siege. It was just a home, waiting for me to return to it. They had laughed when I went to court. They had mocked my resolve, underestimated my strength, and bet everything on their ability to bully and lie their way to victory. But as I closed the door and turned the key in the lock, a profound certainty settled in my soul. The laughter had died in that courtroom, choked off by the sound of a judge's gavel and the crushing weight of the truth. No one was laughing now. The light in Tuscany was different. It was softer, older, drenching the rolling hills and ancient stone villas in a honeyed glow that seemed to forgive everything. For 2 weeks, I walked. I walked through cobblestone streets in medieval hill towns where time felt suspended. I walked through vineyards heavy with ripe grapes, their scent rich and earthy on the air. I sat in quiet, cool churches and looked at frescoes of saints and Madonnas, their faces etched with a peace that transcended centuries. I was alone, but for the first time in over a year, I was not lonely. The silence within me had changed. It was no longer the silence of absence, but the silence of presence, my own presence. On my last evening, I sat on a terrace overlooking the Val d'Orcia, a glass of local Brunello in my hand. The sun was setting, painting the sky in streaks of violet and orange. I thought about David. Not with the sharp, gut-wrenching pain of fresh grief, but with a deep, enduring love that had been woven into the very fabric of my being. I missed him. I would always miss him. But the missing was no longer an open wound. It was a scar strong, a part of my history, a testament to what I had loved and lost. I realized then that the lawsuit, for all its ugliness, had been a brutal, necessary crucible. It had forced me to engage with the world at a time when all I wanted to do was retreat into my sorrow. It had introduced me to a version of myself I never knew existed, a fighter, a strategist, a woman of immense resilience. David had seen that woman in me. The fight had been my terrible, painful journey to finding her for myself. When I returned home, the house welcomed me. It smelled of lemon polish and fresh air. Grace had been in while I was away, airing it out, leaving a vase of cheerful yellow sunflowers on the kitchen table. It was no longer David's in my house, it was mine. And I was no longer David's widow, I was Ruth, whole, scarred, and finally, free. The inheritance was no longer a burden or a prize, it was a tool, a responsibility. I thought long and hard about what David would have wanted. He was a builder, a creator. He would have wanted this money to build something, to do some good. I set up a scholarship at the local technical college in his name, for students pursuing architecture and design. I donated a significant sum to the Brain Tumor Research Center that had treated him with such compassion. And I kept a more than comfortable amount for myself, a foundation of security that allowed me to breathe without a knot of anxiety in my chest. I did not, however, simply retreat into a life of quiet charity. The fight had ignited a spark in me. I started volunteering with a local organization that provided legal support and resources to elderly victims of financial abuse. I sat with terrified men and women who were being exploited by their own children or caregivers, and I told them my story. I saw the recognition in their eyes, the shock that someone else understood their particular flavor of hell. I helped them find their voice. I became, in my small way, an Auntie Clara to strangers. One afternoon, about 6 months after the verdict, I was working in my restored garden. The oak tree was in full leaf, casting a dappled shade over the flower beds I had replanted. A car pulled up. It was a sleek, expensive sedan. The driver's door opened, and Mark got out. He looked diminished. The expensive suit was gone, replaced with slacks and a polo shirt that seemed too big for him. The smug, calculating energy that had always surrounded him like a force field had evaporated. He looked tired and older than his years. He stood by his car, not approaching, as if waiting for permission. I put down my trowel and stood, wiping my hands on my jeans. I didn't speak, I just waited. He finally walked over, stopping a respectful distance away. He looked at the house, the garden, everywhere, but at me. "Ruth," he began, his voice rough. I was in the neighborhood. We both knew it was a lie. He lived 40 minutes away. He shoved his hands in his pockets. "I heard about the scholarship. That was good of you." I remained silent. I would not make this easy for him. The silence stretched, becoming unbearable for him. He finally met my eyes, and what I saw there wasn't apology, but a kind of bewildered defeat. "I lost the partnership," he said abruptly, the words ripped from him. "The firm, when the details of the case, the judge's ruling, it became known. They said I was a reputational risk. Simon's wife left him, took the kids. He was listing his losses like items on a balance sheet. There was no remorse for what he had done to David, to me. Only a stunned disbelief at the consequences that had finally, belatedly, found him. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, and my voice was calm, neutral. I was sorry for the human pain, but I felt no responsibility for it. He stared at me, as if waiting for more. For absolution. For a share of the money he felt was still rightfully his. When it became clear nothing was coming, his face hardened slightly, the old mark flickering to life for a moment. "You really did a number on us, Ruth," he said, a hint of the old venom returning. That was all I needed to hear. It confirmed everything. "No, Mark," I said, my voice quiet but absolute. "You did a number on yourselves. You did it when you stole from your dying brother. You did it when you lied under oath. You did it when you tried to destroy my life to get what you wanted. The court just made it official." He flinched as if I'd struck him. He had no comeback. All his lies, his manipulations, his salesman's charm were useless here, in the simple, unassailable truth of my garden. He gave a curt, jerky nod, turned on his heel, and got back in his car. He drove away, and I knew I would never see him again. There was no dramatic confrontation, no satisfying moment of capitulation, just the quiet, final whimper of a defeated man. The karma was complete. It wasn't fiery or dramatic. It was the cold, slow, inevitable collapse of a life built on sand. I went back to my weeding. My hands were in the earth, the sun was on my back, and my heart was at peace. That evening, my aunties came over. We sat on the back porch with glasses of iced tea, watching the fireflies begin their twilight dance over the lawn. The conversation was easy, meandering from Clara's new paint color to Grace's upcoming cruise. After a comfortable silence, Grace sighed contentedly. "You know, Ruth, looking at you now, it's like seeing a different person. A lighter person." Clara took a sip of her tea. "She's the same person. She just knows herself better now." I looked from one to the other, these two women who had been my rocks, my generals, my family. I thought about the long, painful road that had led me to this peaceful evening. "Auntie Grace, Auntie Clara," I began, my voice soft. "I've been thinking a lot lately, about everything that happened, and I think I finally understand the lesson in it all." They both turned to me, their faces expectant, loving. "It wasn't just about learning to be strong," I said. "I think we all have a strength inside us we don't know about until life demands it. No, the lesson was about discernment, about learning to tell the difference between the rock and the sand." I gestured around us. "David was my rock. You two are my rock. The friends who stood by me, they are rock. And Mark and Simon, they were sand. They always had been. I just didn't want to see it. I thought family was supposed to be rock, so I convinced myself they were." I took a deep breath, the clarity of it all settling deep within me. The lesson is to build your life on the rock, to invest your love, your trust, your energy in the people and the things that are solid and true. And when you encounter the sand, the users, the manipulators, the people whose love is conditional on what you can give them, you don't try to build on it. You don't waste your strength shouting at it or trying to change it. You just let it be sand. You acknowledge it for what it is, and you walk away. You protect the beautiful, solid life you're building from its shifting, unstable nature. Grace reached over and squeezed my hand, her eyes shining with tears. "Oh, Ruth," Clara gave one of her rare, genuine smiles. "Took you long enough to figure it out," she said, her voice gruff with affection. "But you got there. That's all that matters." I smiled back. I got there. We sat there in the gathering dark, the three of us, surrounded by the solid, enduring things, friendship, love, truth, and the quiet, unshakable peace of a battle honorably fought and a life rebuilt, stone by steady stone, on a foundation that could never be washed away. They had laughed when I went to court. But no one was laughing now. I was living. And my life, with all its scars and its hard-won wisdom, had never been more truly, completely my own. Up next, 2 more incredible stories are waiting for you right on your screen. If you enjoyed this one, you won't want to miss these. Just click to watch and don't forget to subscribe.